The topic of gender seems to me controversial from two aspects, in the sense that people not only differ on what positions they hold on the topic, they also differ on the nature of that thing is, which is gender. So there are two things to address, and I think a lot of the differences people have is because the argument has gone, let's say, way too political. People usually hold the position and then they define what that thing is based on that position. And we shouldn't take the leap, let's say, this way. It should be backwards. It should be defining what that thing is, understanding it, and then as a consequence of that, we can take a position on the topic. So today we're going to do exactly that, in the sense that we're going to try to define what gender is exactly. So if we start off with the Merriam-Webster definition of gender, we see things like the characteristics that different humans show, whether it's masculine or feminine. So I think this is not very much of a descriptive definition, let's say. Some people would prefer to define it as an internal process of feeling masculine or feminine, in that vague, let's say, definition. But I would put it in a, let's say, much more clear sense to me. I think it's much more clear to define it as a statistical correlation between different human temperaments and biological sexes, which is biological male and biological female. So I think a good way to think about this definition is to take it in the form of a thought experiment. So maybe back in the day, a few scientists sat on a table and they were like, we want to prove the hypothesis that certain human temperaments are generally correlated with biological males, and different human temperaments are generally correlative with biological females. Maybe they take a sample of biological males and then they see what temperaments they predominantly have, and then they correlate it with that. And now we see, after the scientists have finished their study, they clumped all the temperaments they found predominantly in biological males and they called it masculine. And then they clumped all the temperaments they found predominantly biological females and they called it feminine. And since we said in the beginning it's a statistical model, the feminine temperament can be found in biological males and the masculine temperament can be found in biological females. Now, within the limits we set towards our definition, we really see that gender is an external descriptive model of human behaviors rather than an internal descriptive process of human behaviors, let's say. To be as clear as possible with regards to our distinction of the internal and the external, we can try to take an example of an accountant calling themselves an accountant, for example. So that would be the equivalent to an external description. Now, the internal side of this description would be why they became an accountant, what objectives do they have as an accountant, and why do they continue to work as an accountant, and all those other internal questions. Now, the internal and the external are not very much separate, but usually the external is very much of a simplification of the internal, let's say. So if somebody tries to over-categorize themselves in an external way, they would end up simplifying their internal state. And the reason why I mention this is I think that a lot of progressive gender movements today actually internalize this model as an ideology. If we take another example of the same scientists sitting at the same table, for example, and let's imagine that they classify people, or they classify biological sexes based on how fast they walk. So they take a sample of biological males and they see that in general, predominantly, they walk 79 kilometers per hour. They take another sample of biological females. They see that in general, they walk 3 to 5 kilometers per hour. So we see in this whole correlation that this doesn't tap into people's internal state, let's say. So what internalizing this model would look like is if a biological female comes and says, I walk 79 kilometers, therefore I'm a man. Or a man saying, I walk 3 to 5 kilometers, therefore I'm a woman. So we see in this example, it becomes clear that it's just a correlation we made with regards to an external behavior and not really an internal disposition of the person, let's say. So if we take this example one step further and try to contrast it with, let's say, non-binary or gender fluid, So the equivalent to a non-binary in our example would be someone who says, or a female saying, for example, I walk 7 to 9 kilometers, but I think about walking 3 to 5 kilometers. Therefore, I'm non-binary, for example. We say that this thought of walking 3 to 5 kilometers per hour is irrelevant to the model, let's say, since it's not really an identity of your thoughts, it's just a descriptive model of how fast you walk, let's say. And we can see the cycle going on from here in the sense that people would start to say, okay, well, how about if I sit down while walking, for example, I would be fluid, for example. And we see all sorts of vagueness entering or some kind of noise entering towards the system in the sense that it becomes much more of a confusing model rather than a descriptive one, let's say. Another thing that might happen is if that person has a new experience, for example, they try to fit it within that model, for example. And we see that rather practically actualizing in some sense by people inventing new words within that model, such as non-binary and gender fluid and all those other things. So that's why we say confusion, because this vicious feedback loop of seeing the human experience is in fact very much reductionist and is not really descriptive of it very much. So to summarize everything we just said, the external model of gender or any external model is never meant to be fully descriptive of a phenomena. And what we see happening with a lot of gender movements today is that an internal description out of this external description is trying to be sought. And what ends up happening is the person following this ideology almost becomes like a server to this model, in the sense that they try to fit any new experiences and thoughts within this model, which is, as we said, not sufficient. And the whole idea of a model is to actually serve a phenomenon, try to understand it, but the whole process becomes backwards if one tries to think through this ideology, let's say. So we see that as far as our analysis goes, there are externally only two genders that represent the two physical or biological sexes. We also see that internal thoughts, experiences, and processes can also be explained with things other than this specific model, let's say. So if a juvenile biological male likes a dress, for example, that doesn't exclusively mean that they're a male trapped in a female body. It might be them liking the color of that dress or any other internal phenomena that we can't tap into within our model, let's say. I'll hopefully attach the blog post to the description if anyone wants to read and expand upon the definitions and the conceptions of gender. And thank you very much for watching the video, and I hope you find this beneficial. See you next time.